All right, good morning. Welcome to Seinfeld. This morning's discussion will be on the heart attack. So, where would you like to start? Observations, comments?
Let's start. Yeah, so I just full disclosure, not a huge not a lot of experience watching Seinfeld. Bad place to be. However, I watched a lot of Curb Your Enthusiasm, a big Larry David fan, so it's fun to go back and kind of watch Seinfeld from that perspective and sort of see his, role in it. And you can definitely see a lot of the jokes kind of coming through that are similar to Curb Your Enthusiasm.
We just couldn't create a didactic on Curb. Just,
yeah, it's a little,
especially if you live stream it. It's just,
yeah, it's a little, yeah, you never know what you're gonna get. No, I thought it was a really interesting episode. Obviously, there's, you said you talked about some of the clinical, more clinical things, but there's definitely some overlap with sort of George's, his whole, what he was going through, mentally, throughout the whole episode.
so let's start there. Let's focus on George. Any particular scene, anything come to mind for George? What caught your eye?
I love when he was having a heart attack, but he still insisted on correcting the bill. He was like, "Wait, a mistake on this bill."
Yeah.
Because that was just so to his character, and I think like shows that on some level he knew he was probably going to be okay, not actually having a heart attack, as much as he kept insisting that he was having a heart attack.
And let's primarily focus, at least initially, on the bill and his attitude or behavior pertaining to the bill. If the answer is no, it's perfectly cool. But if you've watched any previous episodes, and this is an early season, or future episodes, have you seen this before in George? Right, so a definitive nod. And if you've seen this as a pervasive pattern of behavior, the next question to ask is it clinically significant? Does it appear to demonstrate some deficit in functioning for George?
I guess you can argue that he's pretty like miserly, which then of course makes you wonder about OCPD because that's the word that they use to describe that diagnosis.
Yeah. So I think if you've seen in previous episodes, if you've seen any episodes over the 9 seasons, the answer would be a definitive yes. This does result in some impairment in functioning for George, especially in interpersonally. And if that's the case, not only would we identify this type of behavior, this specific behavior, as abnormal, but also disordered, because that is always the cutoff for a disorder in the DSM when it impairs functioning. And as soon as you say yes here, then you have to specify, well, then what? Like, what is the most likely diagnosis? And the word miser actually does come up, at least as a root, in one definition of the DSM, and it's obsessive compulsive personality. Right. So let's start there. What is obsessive compulsive personality and how and I don't want to hear the word syntonic or dystonic, right? But how does it differ from obsessive compulsive disorder? Yeah. And don't describe
Sure.
syntonic or dystonic behavior either.
I think one thing that's interesting with the diagnosis of OCPD is that it talks about like, it's like an inability to complete things because of like this tendency towards perfectionism and like order. And so like, you start a lot of things, but you don't finish very much. I should also talk about this. I hear George a lot too about how he starts all these jobs and it ends up having to like leave all these jobs throughout the season.
Almost 100% of the time.
Right.
So I heard 2 things. I heard order and I heard perfectionism. Is there another diagnostic label or maybe quasi-diagnostic label that we often use to describe someone who is perfectionistic and orderly? Outside of psychiatry. Just type A personality.
Yeah.
Right. And what I would ask you to do is your favorite board review book, maybe even the DSM, read through the diagnostic criteria of or for obsessive compulsive personality with type A personality in mind, and you'll never forget OCPD. Right. You'll also notice what is not part of the definition, because you could read it with a fine-tooth comb and you're not, except for the title, which is sort of a misnomer, you're not going to see the word obsession or compulsion as part of the diagnosis. So when you see someone who has these intrusive thoughts, obsessions, or these ritualistic behaviors, so as to alleviate the anxiety that are caused by those thoughts, compulsions, that's OCD, right? That's not OCPD.
Hmm.
OCPD is actually that perfectionistic type A personality,
Hmm.
right? Two very different descriptions. Now there's overlap,
Hmm.
right? And there's also a proposed shared etiology, which is the original reason why these two seemingly distinct conditions are labeled very, very similarly. So let's talk about the etiology, right? Because this may come up on the shelf exam. What causes obsessive compulsive disorder? Not the personality disorder, but OCD.
Well, so one thing I'm thinking is a lot of times, the obsession could be like around cleanliness, right? And let's say like you, are in healthcare and you don't sterilize or you don't clean something right, and then that kind of shapes you, so maybe there's like a triggering event. And that causes you to have this obsession over cleanliness. So I guess there could be like a triggering event, but oftentimes do we see it just like sporadically, and maybe there's like some genetic influence, but it's just more sporadic.
Yeah,
Not for sure.
I think your observation is right on, and I'll just kind of paraphrase it
Yeah.
and summarize.
Of course.
It sounds like there are biopsycho and social antecedents to behavior that you're identifying, right? Some genetic predisposition, gene expression, etc. Perhaps some experience socially, and maybe the way in which the individual copes with that and develops coping strategies. Maybe we'll even call them defense mechanisms. The defense mechanisms are fair play on exams. And in this case, the single best answer is isolation of affect, often abbreviated isolation. That's a subconscious process that allows us to cope, right? The idea here is that there's this impulse that you do not want to come to conscious expression, right? Can't, because it's taboo. And in one way in which you can effects or discharge this, but in such a distorted way that society, your mom and dad, other, allow it, that your superego, is through the defense mechanism. So what happens is that for isolation anyway, you separate the idea from the affect or emotion. That affect is isolated in your subconscious. It stays isolated. But the idea comes to conscious awareness so that you're able to talk about it, discharge it, but in a way that it's not threatening, right? I mean, you're literally not emotionally invested in the discussion because the affect is isolated, right? So that's isolation of affect, and that's thought to be a proposed etiology, at least the psychological part of the biopsychosocial origin or etiology of obsessive compulsive disorder. We won't get too much into this, but I could also relate to you that it's the same etiology, that is isolation of affect, that plays a major role in OCPD as well. Hence why we named it similarly. Right, there's your reason why. All right. All right. Now, having said all this, getting back to George, getting back to your initial observation, it is true that he's very miserly. And it's very true that his miserly spending style is pervasive and it's stable over time. And therefore, it seems to be a characterological defect. Are there any other aspects of the obsessive compulsive personality, the type A personality, that seems to be manifesting George Costanza, either in this episode or subsequent episodes? If your answer is no, then he actually does not rule in for OCPD, obviously. I don't think so either. I'm taking the radio silence, the hesitation as a no, and I agree. I've looked, and it's not there. It isn't there, and I think you need 4 total, and he's got one that is just absolutely slam dunked here, but it's a stretch to find any of the other 3. And so nothing really going on here in terms of an actual diagnosis for George, at least per the behavior that we see manifest in the heart attack. And there's some other aspect of his behavior. What is it? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he believes he's having a heart attack, right? And here we're gonna just play a little bit with semantics. Excuse me, almost said semantics. But in this case, you have an individual, George, who appears to become preoccupied, right? And I'm exchanging the clinical term preoccupation for obsession. cutting hairs, but in this case, it looks as if he's struggling with a preoccupation syndrome. Right? And the preoccupation is with having a serious or perhaps even acquiring a serious illness. When that preoccupation results in clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning, what do we call it? Now, when the obsession slash preoccupation, the abnormal thought,
Mm.
is primarily focused on acquiring an illness or having a serious illness, we call it something different.
Oh, like
Yeah.
when it's about acquiring illness.
Oh, it's like,
I thought it was just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm wrong.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
It-
different than we
you-
think.
Just like hypothetical.
exactly.
Do we use that term anymore?
No.
No.
Yeah, okay.
2013, the latest revision phased that term out in lieu of illness anxiety disorder. And as such, moved this condition, formerly known as hypochondriasis, into the obsessive compulsive and related disorder chapter, right? So, in a question like, or a shelf question like this, I can envision OCD being answer A and illness anxiety disorder answer C or D. Against the preoccupation with having or acquiring a serious illness, such as an acute coronary syndrome. That's the heart of it. What if George's preoccupation, what if his abnormal thought increases in intensity to a point where he actually crosses that line of reality testing?
Reality testing down, so.
Well, now he has an absolute belief that he's having a heart attack that cannot, in fact, be swayed.
It's like, almost like a delusion.
That's it. And then what would you call that?
So,
Exactly. Right. And there are 5 subtypes of delusional disorder, and this would be somatic subtype, right? So the differential, and I could envision this on a shelf exam as well, where delusional disorder is choice D, is really primarily focused on the definition itself of the abnormal thought. Is it a preoccupation or is it a delusion? And that line that is always crossed is one of reality testing. If there's a breach in reality testing, the individual is delusional and therefore delusional disorder. More specifically, somatic type is your single best answer.
Yeah, what if they believe they're like really sick and something's wrong? And as a result, we can compulsive, like, or you compulsive like testing and like researching and health checking. Is that OCD without insight?
Right, right. So, and I was going to actually bring this up. So, the way to approach the test, quite a way to approach this clinically, is to try to differentiate between the preoccupation versus the delusion. And you could say the same thing about OCD, the obsession versus the delusion. And in this case, obsessions and preoccupations are intermediate forms of thought content, or at least deficits in thought content that are of intermediate severity, right? But both are distinguished from the delusion, right? There is a clinical situation in which someone could have OCD. There is similarly a clinical situation in which someone can actually have a illness anxiety disorder. But in any one slice of time today, maybe there's a stressor. Maybe they wake up and Plum Street's closed because of this a construction accident. That stress may actually induce psychosis. That is, may actually result in such a situation that insight wanes and the individual crosses that line. You could see how it would be kind of unfair to label someone delusional at that point. And say, well, this just seems to be a manifestation of their pre-existing illness anxiety disorder. But the profound lack of insight results in them really presenting or appearing delusional. Right? So you can see that there's like this middle ground or this gray area. The American Psychiatric Association addressed this in the latest revision of the DSM, where now you don't change the diagnosis. You don't change a person's diagnosis every 24 hours because of their waxing and waning stress levels. Instead, you keep the original diagnosis, whether it's OCD, whether it's illness anxiety disorder, and have a qualifier with absent insight or with no insight. Right. And the overall description, the phenomenon of what's happening, the logistic, if you will, is one that is referred to as stress-induced psychosis. That makes sense? It's a little tricky the way things are worded now in the latest revision of the DSM. That addressed the question.
Yeah, I appreciate like that, so I was curious about it.
Yeah, I really think it's the APA's effort to not mislabel people or without this. Five. Yeah. Mhm. All right. So anything else with George? What are the characters you want to talk about today? We're already at the bottom of the hour of our little late stuff. We'll give it another 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, that is a very nice.
What's-
Yeah.
Actual.
Tor? Oh, the tongue. I thought you-
Yeah.
tongue versus Tor. All right. I both are a little. Well, let's just say they could be under psychiatric observation. What's going on with Elaine's new BF?
An appropriate date.
Yeah.
He wanted to kiss her. I was like.
Do you think like he felt to be impressed by his like medical knowledge, like medical so to speak? Or...
I feel like he went down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like that was the initial, like, yeah, and then it just evolved into.
I think it also speaks to like shallowness, and she's gonna be with him solely because he's a doctor.
Right.
And they're being upset because he provided a medical knowledge.
Yeah.
That is an interesting twist, right? Let's focus a little bit on him though. Because we're gonna have plenty of time to focus on Elaine, right? In the next four plus weeks of your life. But for him, what part of his history, and I know it's not written or explicit, might be in place that would not surprise you if you were to provide a 60-minute psychiatric evaluation? What are some of the things that maybe right now in the back of your mind that you'd want to probe? And maybe not in the initial psychophile, but maybe when you're engaged in psychotherapy.
I don't know, started to find out the autism spectrum disorder, the history of that, because he had no sense that that was inappropriate.
Right. Yeah, he's totally missing social cues here.
Mhm.
And you know, when people feel isolated, whether it's due to an established mental disorder or other, they can, as a coping skill, just throw themselves into some mission. Right? Not submission, some mission with an N. And in this case, it might be the medical field. Right? He might feel much more comfortable reading medical journals than interacting with you. And that could be functional. I mean, he turned out to be an exceptional doctor. But there might be some forms of dysfunction as well. And we see that play out here. So that's something that comes to mind. And then we could begin, if that were the case, then we could begin a differential diagnosis, and ASD might be in that differential, right? You know, there's a really terrific movie called Misery that's based on a Stephen King novel. And not so ironically, it happens to focus on an individual in the medical field where a nurse loses both her father and then her husband, and actually says that she throws herself into these Paul Sheldon novels as a result, takes night shifts nursing so she can just isolate herself. And she has a breach in reality testing in terms of, are these characters real? Am I real? What does this mean in terms of what I'm doing? Not totally distinct from what we see from Dr. Tung here. Again, we're painting a lot for this individual, but that's something that might be in the back of your mind that you might want to inquire about.